Thank you for joining our Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer webinar on the role of clinical trials for cancer patients. Clinical trials are the primary means by which new cancer treatments are developed, tested, and approved. In this webinar, you will learn why a clinical trial may be right for you, understand the different phases of and common terms used in clinical trials, and hear tips on talking to your doctor about your clinical trial options. I am Mary Margaret Kilmeyer, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I'm the Patient Resource Manager for Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and currently completing my doctorate. My clinical and research background is focused on working collaboratively with doctors, patients, their families, and members of a healthcare team. We would like to thank Genentech for providing funding for making this webinar possible. We would also like to thank our promotional partners, the American Association for Cancer Research, the Anti-Cancer Club, Cure Magazine, the Esophageal Cancer Action Network, Meals to Heal, and Patient Resource. You will be able to ask questions during this presentation. You can type your question into the white text box that appears on your screen. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will address questions as time allows. If we don't have time to address your question today, we will address it during our next webinar taking place on May 6th at 12 noon Eastern Time. In addition, the recording of this webinar will be accessible on our website in approximately 1 week. Now I will introduce Debbie Zellman, who will share with you her journey and information about Debbie's Dream Foundation. Then Dr. Andrew Kennedy will present clinical trials for the cancer patient. And then there will be time for a question and answer session at the end. I would now like to introduce the president and founder of Debbie's Dream Foundation, Debbie Zellman.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. Hello, and welcome to everyone who's on the call and who has stayed on the call after our wonderful nutrition webinar. Please advance the slide. I was diagnosed in April of 2008 with stage 4 stomach cancer. At the time of my diagnosis, I was only 40 years old. I had 3 young children, I was married to a physician, and I was a practicing attorney with my own firm. I had no risk factors for stomach cancer, and my symptoms were very vague. My chances of being alive at my diagnosis was only 4% in 5 years. I'm happy to tell you that this month will be my 7-year anniversary of my diagnosis. When I was diagnosed, however, there were very few resources, very little information out there about stomach cancer. So a year after my diagnosis, which was April 2009, I founded Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. However, people don't realize that I am still a stomach cancer patient. I receive Herceptin by IV every 3 weeks and an oral chemo called Tykerb every night. I am a patient advocate on the National Cancer Institute Esophagogastric Task Force, on the NCCN Gastric and Esophageal Guidelines Committee, on the Department of Defense Peer Review Cancer Research Program Integration Panel, on the American Society of Clinical Oncology HER2 Testing Gastric Cancer Project, and on the NCI Patient Advocacy Steering Committee. We are also, as an organization, a member of the Deadliest Cancers Coalition, the Patient Equal Access Coalition, the State Patient Equal Access Coalition, and One Voice Against Cancer. And even after all those things, people tell me that my biggest achievement is I appeared in an episode about stomach cancer on Dr. Oz. Next slide. So some facts about stomach cancer. Stomach cancer is one of the leading causes of cancer death worldwide, second in men and fourth in women. Each year, nearly 1 million people will be diagnosed with stomach cancer and approximately 700,000 will die. It's anticipated in 2015 that more than 24,000 Americans will be diagnosed with stomach cancer, and more than 11,000 will die. Unfortunately, we're finding that stomach cancer is on the rise in young people ages 25 to 39, and the cause is not known. Per cancer death in the U.S., stomach cancer receives the least amount of federal research funding of any cancer. There are few resources and support services, and most people know very little about the disease. Next slide. So Debbie's Dream Foundation, we started to change all those things. We want to raise awareness about stomach cancer. We're advancing funding for research, both direct funding and indirect funding. And we provide free education and support internationally for patients, families, and caregivers with the ultimate goal to make the cure for stomach cancer a reality. Our website is www.debystream.org. Next slide. This month will be the 6-year anniversary of DeByStream Foundation, but already we've achieved many milestones. Our website is very rich with in-depth stomach cancer information, a lecture library, clinical trial information and matching service, a stomach cancer support community that is like no other, many blog topics and resources that are completely translatable into more than 60 languages. We have a free patient resource education program, abbreviated PrEP, which helps hundreds of patients, families, and caregivers throughout the world, matching those inquirers with other stomach cancer survivors and caregivers using specific disease criteria, including stage, biomarker, age, gender, and region. We have a stomach cancer education symposium each year. The upcoming one is April 18th, which I'll tell you a little more about in a few minutes, and free webinars like this one. Believe it or not, as of today, this little bullet point is now out of date. We now have 26 chapters in the United States, Canada, and Germany, with events across the U.S. and $150,000 in direct research grant funding. We have had 3 very successful stomach cancer Capitol Hill advocacy days and a Capitol Hill briefing, the first ever of its kind on stomach cancer. Our advocacy was so successful that we were able to have stomach cancer included in a $50 million pot of money through the DoD peer-reviewed cancer research program, so that researchers can now compete for those funding. Next slide. And here you can see our website, just a little snapshot of the home page. Our website has been accessed by thousands and thousands of people who get assistance from all those resources on the website that I've talked about, as well as access our events and the news, make donations, and are able to contact us. And also figure out how to take action themselves. How do I get involved? So this is a great opportunity to look at the website and do all or one of those things. Next slide. Here's just a brief summary, just 5 things that are coming up with DeByStream. But like I said, there's many, many things that we're working on. Tomorrow, for example, is a basketball game, the Cleveland Cavaliers versus the Miami Heat, and taking place in Cleveland, Ohio. And they have tickets still available, I believe, that you can attend, and a % of the tickets go to DeByStream. Very notably, I want to point out for everyone on this webinar is a free stomach cancer symposium that we are holding in Fort Lauderdale on April 18th. Now, many of you are not in Fort Lauderdale, so you're saying, well, I'd like to go down there. I'm sure the weather's beautiful, but that's quick and I can't make it, or I don't feel well enough, or one of those things. Please note that the symposium is available for in-person attendance, but it's also available for you to attend via webcast, just like you are today. At night, we hold a Dreammakers Gala to celebrate all that we've accomplished all year. We do hold also an International Stomach Cancer Genes Day. That will be November 13th. And again, anyone internationally can participate in that. And just an example of another event we have, January 24th, 2016 is our Miami Marathon and Half Marathon. But I know there are also many things coming up, including a Chicago Half Marathon. Okay, next slide. Now I'm going to turn the webinar back over to our wonderful moderator, Mary Margaret Kellmeyer, and thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Debbie. DeByStream Foundation is headquartered in Davie, Florida. Our office is open from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. On this slide, you will also see important phone numbers and email addresses to contact our office. We will start the presentation on demystifying clinical trials. Our presenter is Dr. Andrew Kennedy. Dr. Andrew Kennedy is the Physician-in-Chief of Radiation Oncology for Sarah Cannon Institute, Research Institute, and the Director of Radiation Oncology for Sarah Cannon Research Institute in Nashville, Tennessee. He is also an adjunct associate professor of the Departments of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and Biomedical Engineering at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. He is an internationally renowned radiation oncologist specializing in gastrointestinal cancers. He presents and publishes extensively and is considered a key opinion leader in radiotherapy treatment. Nationally, he has served as a member on the Board of Chancellors for the American College of Radiation Oncology and is a fellow of the college. Since 2009, he has been selected annually as one of America's best doctors and was inducted into Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society as a faculty member in 1999. Dr. Kennedy refined and improved upon the most commonly used protocol in the U.S. for the use of microspheres and is the recipient of more than $1 million in research grants to further investigate this and other cancer treatments. At this time, I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Kennedy.
Well, thank you so much, Mary Margaret. I may have you advance to the next slide. Oh, okay. So the task today is to demystify or clarify what clinical trials are. And what I hope to do is, by going through this outline of stomach anatomy, structure, how we diagnose it, how we stage it, try to tie that to how that might impact an individual patient's choice of either entering a clinical trial or being considered for a trial. So try to help you see how physicians stratify these different pieces before offering a clinical trial. Many of the listeners will know a lot of details about their personal struggle with stomach cancer or their spouse or loved one, but trying to start from the beginning and move forward so everyone has the same baseline of information before I finish up with the exact details of what phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials are. So we can go to the next slide. The stomach, as you may know, is located right in the middle of very high-priced real estate. So on this slide, the stomach is in blue, and this comes from a wonderful document that you can find on the American Cancer Society website. And all of the structures you see surrounding the stomach are very sensitive to being perturbed by either surgery or radiation or chemotherapy. So in that high-risk area, we have to balance the treatment that we know will get rid of the cancer with what the collateral injury will be. So one of the tasks when we're designing clinical trials is to take that into consideration, that we may have something, some intervention to do, which is really a good idea, getting rid of the cancer, but unfortunately would compromise, let's say, the liver, and so therefore very few patients would be eligible for it. So those are some of the considerations. The stomach is underneath the rib cage, so any type of surgery to get there and to take it out requires a surgeon to do a fairly invasive procedure. So I'm going to cover non-surgical treatments as well, because those are often added either to surgery in a clinical trial, or when patients are not eligible to get surgery for a variety of reasons, they often have the option of chemotherapy and radiation given together on a clinical trial. Go to the next slide. This is a close-up drawing of the stomach, and what we see is some dividing lines, and up at the top where it says fundus, that's the very top portion of the stomach, and it abuts right underneath the heart. Just to the left of that is something called the cardia, and the reason I point that out is that we often consider the cardia to be something we call the GE junction, or the gastroesophageal junction. And that's important because some clinical trials will only allow patients into that study if they have either esophagus cancer or gastric cancer. So when you're in the middle there, the cardia, it's very important that your physician, or if you're looking on the website, on the Cancer.gov website, that you understand that GE junction tumors sometimes are eligible for both esophagus protocols and treatments and cancers of the stomach, or the gastric cancers. Down towards the bottom in the antrum and pylorus, that's the very end part of the stomach, sometimes those are very important structures because they're attached to or in close association with the liver or the pancreas. Go to the next slide. The actual wall of the stomach has multiple layers, And the importance of this is we know when the stomach tumor starts, it's very often in the mucosa or the lining, and that has a certain risk assigned to it. And we usually assign risks by what we call stage, and the T, N, and M staging I'm going to get to in a few slides. But in this particular organ, the risk of having tumors get away from the stomach depends on how deeply it penetrates into the wall. So tumors that are on the surface, or what we call the mucosa, are usually stage 1 or T1. They're more often cured with a surgery because the tumor cells may not have gotten access to lymphatic channels and other tissues that could take the tumor cells away from that part of the stomach. But as the tumor penetrates into the muscle part, which you see there called muscularis propria, or even further into the outer lining called the serosa, then the risks of it disseminating increase. And so we are talking about clinical trials. We base them on a variety of factors, but one of them would be the stage. And the stage in stomach cancer depends on how deeply it's penetrated as the main factor. And then another important factor, which we'll get to shortly, is has it spread to lymph nodes or other organs. So the structure of the stomach is very important, and it's similar in its staging to the organ above it, which is the esophagus. Next slide. So for many patients, they have 1 or 2 symptoms before they're diagnosed. Other patients have a cluster of many of them. And as you can see from this listing, none of them is very specific. So we've all had nausea and vomiting. Most patients have experienced heartburn throughout their life off and on. So these alone aren't a diagnosis of stomach cancer. And in fact, some patients don't have anything that they can point to as a symptom, but their tumor is discovered because of a blood test or incidentally found because of a scan. But these are the most often reported side effects of a tumor in the stomach by patients. And so as your oncologist asks you questions, in part they're trying to build on this database and see if your symptoms and your tumor line up with what many other patients have also experienced. Sometimes this diagnosis or symptom list can help us stratify patients according to next best treatment. Go to the next slide. The stomach is predominantly made up of cells that secrete substances to digest food. And that particular cell type, when it becomes a cancer, we call it an adenocarcinoma. And that is the vast majority, over 90% of cancers that affect the stomach will be this type, adenocarcinoma. And so most of what you will see on any website about treatments for stomach cancer will be focused, whether it says it or not, on adenocarcinoma. And the importance there is that if you have that 10% or less of patients that have a tumor other than adenocarcinoma, not only are the choices for clinical trials much less, but they're highly specific for this uncommon tumor you have. And so don't get discouraged if you're searching or your family members are searching on the website, the government website for a trial, where you're trying to match up, and everything you're finding is adenocarcinoma. There are trials for these other tumor types that are much less frequent. But one of the important things also to know is that adenocarcinomas usually are treated with some combination of standard chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery. But lymphomas, which are immune cells or tumor-fighting cells that are in your lymph system, many times we can treat without having a major surgery in some combination of limited radiation and limited chemotherapy. Likewise, gastrointestinal stromal tumors, or GIST tumors, there is a drug that was developed, and actually we call it a designer drug. It was designed for GIST tumors some years ago, and it has done an amazing job at arresting these tumors without the need for surgery or chemotherapy or radiation. And then finally, carcinoid tumors, which sometimes in a bigger category are called neuroendocrine tumors, they have a very different treatment pattern that is not like all those above it. It's generally not a tumor that gets lots of chemotherapy or surgery or radiation. And there's very specific treatments for carcinoid tumors that are not currently on trials. There's very few trials or open protocols for neuroendocrine tumors, but a few. So take home here is that if you are in the majority, the 90% that have adenocarcinomas, then you will probably have a larger variety of trials to choose from. But all of those listed there, and that makes up 99% of the tumors of the stomach, there are open trials now internationally for all of them. Go to the next slide. I mentioned the staging earlier, and that is by a T, N, and M. T stands for tumor, N for lymph nodes, and M for metastasis. So the tumor is not size, which it is in other tumor types, such as breast or skin cancers. The T would be determined by size. Lung cancer is another example. But in the stomach, how deeply it penetrates is really the more important factor for tumor. Node, or the N portion there, is a unified way of oncologists speaking to other oncologists with when we say it has spread out of the primary site and gone into lymph nodes, we can stratify that by not only risk of recurrence, but overall survival by knowing the N, whether it's N1, N2, etc. And then the M, or metastasis, generally is a category for when we have discovered that the tumor cells are no longer in the stomach, and they're not maybe in a lymph node, but they're in another organ, such as liver or lung or bone. So stratifying patients in this way, patients of a similar type of tumor class and spread would be put in one protocol, one clinical trial, versus patients that may have much more disease and in many other organs would certainly be more appropriate for a different clinical trial. So the staging of stomach cancer has a lot of importance, not only in deciding the best treatment for patients, but just as importantly, deciding what would be the proper protocol for them to consider if they wanted to go on a clinical trial. Next slide. So that we don't have everyone fall asleep with all the staging, I just broke this up into three main categories. So stage 0 would be tumors that are just on the surface of the stomach wall, so the inside where the food is. And those generally have the lowest risk of coming back. There are very high cure rates if a surgeon can approach it, remove it, and not have to remove the whole stomach. Those are patients that generally would not benefit from radiation and chemotherapy. So stage 0 means it has not invaded into the areas of risk for spreading. We call that in situ. The bulk of patients, however, are in stages 1, 2, and 3. And those are patients that have some combination of penetrating the wall or spreading to regional lymph nodes. And that's the majority of patients that we find, certainly in the United States, for treatment. And based on a lot of different factors, those patients would either be offered all 3 of the major treatments, starting with surgery, then chemotherapy and radiation, or sometimes that's reversed, chemotherapy and radiation together, followed by surgery. But that's the mainstay. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the chemotherapy and radiotherapy options that are newer and that are incorporating into trials here shortly. But think of that middle group as the majority of patients today with stomach cancer. And then the stage 4 patients, those are a group of patients that, by definition, it has metastasized, where the tumor cells have spread from the stomach to another organ. And in those patients, it may not make sense to remove the primary tumor, the stomach, because they may not have a lot of tumor in the stomach. So they might have a surgery, but more often than not, stage 4 patients are more concentrating on therapies that treat all of the tumor at once, and that's usually some form of chemotherapy and sometimes radiation added to that for improving a symptom. Next slide. So surgery is pretty simple for most people to have a mental picture of. I would say that I'm not a surgeon, so I'm hopefully not going to do them disservice, but there are a variety of ways that they can approach the stomach, and most of them require the abdomen to be open, but as many of you may know, laparoscopy, or putting little scopes into the abdomen, is another option for some patients. But generally, when we're first getting to know patients in our GI tumor team, we do the first separation of patients that are resectable, so they have something that we think the surgeon can help us with, versus those patients where, at least immediately, there is not a surgical option. And we might get them to that point by giving chemotherapy and radiation. And that's a very important focus of current clinical trials. Can we optimize tumor shrinkage to allow someone to have a potentially curative surgery? So those are the two big buckets for the surgeon. Is there a role for him or her or not? The next treatment, which I would say just about every patient has chemotherapy, because it will attack tumors no matter whether we see them or not anywhere in the body. But rather than go through a list of traditional chemotherapy agents, I thought I would highlight the targeted agents. That's one of the newest classes of drugs to kill cancers. And there are two in particular that are being used very effectively in stomach cancers, particularly adenocarcinomas. There is clinical trial evidence, so patients have gone into clinical trials that tested these new targeted agents compared to another group that didn't receive them, and that evidence shows that when you got the targeted agents, you were able to have better control of the tumor. It stayed away longer. There were higher cure rates. So the clinical trial process was extremely important in all of our current cancer breakthroughs, but since we're focusing on stomach, I wanted to mention targeted agents, and on the next slide I think I have the first targeted agent to talk about. First, a definition then. So some patients are, and it is very confusing, if we say molecular agents or targeted agents, they might think of a genetic situation where they were born with an error in some of their cells that led to the cancer. And that's not what I'm going to be talking about here. This is something very different, although we sometimes refer to it as molecularly targeted or targeted agents. In this particular situation, we want to use a drug or a chemical of some form that will block a tumor cell from doing what it wants to do. Sometimes that is an antibody, which is a tiny little particle that recognizes a tumor cell, and sometimes that antibody recognizes something else, like a blood vessel or a protein. So there are a variety of ways, and I just listed 5 of them there at the bottom, of targets of these special agents. So this is different from traditional chemotherapy, where the chemotherapy that we use today doesn't specify between a tumor cell and a normal cell. It instead goes to the cells that are more actively dividing and using resources, and these chemotherapy agents often get incorporated into the replication of the DNA in that tumor cell or the normal cell, and then kills or injures that cell. These are different in how they behave, and so they're targeted because they are hopefully only going to be affecting the tumor cells and not the normal cells. Next slide. So the first, and this is the trade name, as Debbie mentioned earlier, is Herceptin. trastuzumab, and this was quite a breakthrough a few years ago based on the success of this drug in treating patients with breast cancer. And because there was a unique receptor on tumor cells in stomach cancer cells, the thought was maybe if we gave the same agent that we give for breast cancer patients, but we give it to now stomach cancer patients, we could get a similar good result. And there was a lot of research prior to starting this with cancer patients. And so the process was identifying the rationale. In this case, was there a target on a stomach cancer cell that we could attach to it and block it from surviving? And so that went through various testing until it got to the final stage of testing where half of the patients got this drug plus something else. The other half of the stomach cancer patients didn't get this drug, and then they were compared. In this case, fortunately, it showed success in that the Herceptin patients who received this drug had a better outcome. And so this is a targeted agent. It does have some side effects, but probably the most difficult one is that, as Debbie mentioned, you have to go every 3 weeks and get an IV placed to receive it. But unlike traditional chemotherapy, it doesn't have a lot of the worst side effects that patients often fear, such as nausea, vomiting, hair loss, etc. So this is one of the success stories of evolving through clinical trials to a targeted agent to help in stomach cancer. The next slide, we talk about the most recent breakthrough, and there's a lot of excitement about this drug. Ramucirumab is similar to the one we just talked about. It's in the same class, but it does something a little different, and it has been recently, with less than a year ago, was approved for treatment in stomach cancers because of a large clinical study that tested it very thoroughly. And the take-home point here is that it doesn't work to kill the cell directly. It is blocking the supply of blood and blood vessels to the tumor. So it's a different target, a different mechanism of trying to kill tumor cells. And again, it's an IV infusion, so there is, it's not a pill, unfortunately, but this is a targeted agent that we're just now getting into mainstream use because it first had to be tested in a clinical trial. But a very exciting drug, and I think we're going to find in the next 5 years a lot more about this drug in combination with other agents that may be targeted. Next slide. So radiation therapy has to be directed, just like surgery, to a specific place. Unlike surgery, it can cover some organs with some radiation that those organs will tolerate it well, unlike surgery where you would have to remove it. So to put this in perspective, while we were learning about targeted agents and getting more specific on chemotherapy, within the radiation oncology world, clinical trials were ongoing to show that we could more carefully and more precisely and accurately deliver radiation to the target and protect normal structures around it. So there have been, and are continuing to be, clinical trials that aren't testing the chemotherapy, but are in fact testing how we give the radiation to the stomach. And so some of the most innovative ways recently has been something called IMRT. And what you see on the right side of the slide is everything that's in red is the target. That's the stomach and some lymph nodes and some areas of concern. And you see below that in yellow is the left kidney, so we don't want any radiation to go to that. And then there's little squiggly lines around it, and those are indications of how much radiation was delivered. This is, as I mentioned, high-priced real estate. So in the past, when we didn't have sophisticated ways of giving radiation, many patients couldn't receive the radiation safely or couldn't tolerate the radiation. It made them too sick. With the use of better technology, better software and planning, we're finding that we can accomplish two things. We can give high doses of radiation where they're needed, and just as importantly, not hitting adjacent structures that don't need any radiation. So currently, clinical trials usually either are testing one thing, which is the radiation, or testing the other thing, which is the targeted therapy. Just in the last year or so, they've been starting to be combined in earlier trials, earlier stage trials, where both could be tested. Next slide. As was mentioned, Debbie, in her website, and this is a picture of the booklet you can download from clinical trials section of the National Cancer Institute. They have a really helpful brochure that's written for non-clinicians, non-doctors, non-nurses, that goes through a lot of what I've been presenting in more detail. But I'm a firm believer in that cancer patients in particular are so helpful when they enter into clinical trials. And we have strong evidence that patients that are on clinical trials get the best outcomes. So obviously you're having an interest because you're listening to this webinar and you're going to a site like Debbie's to learn more about it. But that's my shameless plug to have patients seek out clinical trials when they're getting their cancer care. Go to the next slide. So throughout all of this discussion, I've just been saying clinical trials in general. I'd like to just spend the last few minutes of our time together talking about what the phases mean, because it may help you understand when you're in that position or you're advising a family member or friend what phase of trial might be best for them. So let's start with the most early stage, or when we know the least amount about a particular agent, and we'll just stick with chemotherapy for now. We know from the process of going through the FDA to get permission to use a new agent in a cancer patient that it has some chance of being effective to kill cancer cells. We know that within the best modeling we can do how we should give it, but we may not know what the right dose is that balances between killing the cancer cells but not unduly injuring the normal structures in the body. So a phase 1 trial is that type of trial which has just a few patients, 15 to 30 patients, and often it is structured that the first 3 to 5 patients will get the study drug at one concentration, and that may be 1 tablet a day, for instance. And then they're watched very carefully to see that all the organs are functioning well, and there's a lot of eyes looking at them and looking at their labs. If after that first 3 to 5 patients everything looks good, then by design they will give the patient or the next set of patients more of that drug, so 2 pills a day. And then depending on how it's structured, they may get to a point where they say, we now know that we can safely give 5 pills a day, but we think the best dose is really 3 pills a day, because that's balancing killing cancer cells but not hurting the patient. So phase 1 studies may help the patient, but they're really looking for the right dose for future patients to take. Now going on to phase 2, that same study drug, let's say we're sticking at that 3 pills a day seems to be best. We want to now get more information around the way we think we're going to use it. So you want to determine, is it effective at 3 pills a day for that cancer? And we may adjust some other things to that. We may even randomize, which means split it in half and say 50 patients are going to get this drug and 50 patients won't. They'll get something else. But generally a phase 2 trial is an important stepping stone for any drug or intervention. There's more patients taking it, therefore our confidence in the results are higher. So we're less likely to get fooled by a statistical aberration. Go to the next slide. So all of the 2 targeted agents that I just talked about went through phase 1 and phase 2, and then the most important and final step for them was to go through phase 3. And that is typically the type of study that you hear on the evening news or you hear about in big newspaper articles, because that's the gold standard. If you have an intervention you think works, you want to test it against what is the current standard of treatment. And for that, you may enroll 1,000 patients, and you may enroll 500. But for cancer patients and cancer drugs, it's generally between 500 and 1,000 patients is a typical phase 3 study. Those take often years to accumulate enough patients to answer the question. And that's because, unfortunately, somewhere around 3% of patients join clinical studies. If we could boost that to 10%, we could answer these questions in a quarter of the time. So phase 3 studies are generally what people think of when they think of a clinical trial testing drug A versus drug B. But as I mentioned, sometimes these clinical trials are not only answering drug A versus drug B, but then we're adding, should they have surgery too, or should they have radiation as well? So it can be more complicated than just one drug versus another. Now finally, and this is a much less known trial, but often the FDA requires this because we may have rapidly accrued patients in the phase 3. We may not have a lot of long-term information on how those patients have done, and so the FDA will require, as we would want them to anyway, we'd want to know this, is if you take the drug and it's very effective and so your tumor goes away, we want to follow you for many years to make sure there isn't something that comes up several years later that we couldn't have anticipated that is a complication of that drug. So a phase 4 study would be more like your physicians are giving you the targeted therapy and they'd ask your permission to enroll on a, sometimes called a registry study even. We just want to track you for the next 5 years to see if anything happens bad out of that drug. So those are the 4 stages of clinical trials, and I often tell my patients they should not feel like, quotes, the guinea pig. They're not. These aren't structured that way, but they really help so many people downstream that it's extremely valuable to consider getting on a clinical trial, not only for what it'll do for you, but maximal learning will come out of your experience. So the next slide. So I'm going to end with this one, and Debbie's site and other sites have very easy to use or much easier to use tools to find a clinical trial that matches your needs and your tumor type. The official repository where all of the clinical trials are stored is on the National Cancer Institute website, and cancer.gov has them. I would say it's not the easiest tool to use, so I'm very thankful that I can direct patients to other websites like Debbie's, but just wanted to put a plug in for them as well, that the NCI, and this is what every taxpayer supports, has the most comprehensive listing of potential trials that you or a loved one could consider joining. And that's all my prepared comments. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kennedy. That was very informative and I'm sure very helpful to everyone who's listening in. We do have a couple of minutes here so that I can review some of our questions. One of the questions that came in, and I'm not sure how much time we have to fully really address this, but is, could you please discuss the immunotherapy trials? I know that there has been a lot lately in the media regarding, perhaps other cancer types, but using, genetic modification or virology.
Sure,
in
outstanding question. So in virus-mediated, as you and many listeners probably saw on 60 Minutes a few days ago, that type of approach has not been expanded to outside of the brain or lung in any trials I'm aware of right now, although they could be. It's not my area of expertise. But that style of using viruses to kill is a very exciting way of doing it, and I hope that we'll see funding sufficient that we can start testing it against multiple tumor types. However, the immunotherapy is something that is here now, commercially available. One of the first drugs, it's called a PD-1 drug, was approved a few weeks ago by the FDA for lung cancer. It is a different mechanism than we've been talking about. It doesn't necessarily block something on the tumor cell, but helps present the tumor cells to your own immune system in a much better way. So in a nutshell, take the army of immune cells that you have in your body, train them to kill tumor cells, and then let them have at it. And the drugs that help us produce that are just now starting. The very first one's been approved. There are multiple other versions of these immune drugs that are in development, that are in phase 1 trials now, going into phase 2. So that's an area of cutting-edge research that, fortunately, if you can get a patient on that trial, they can receive that medication for no cost, but we do know that that is an extremely low toxicity, that immune therapies that are currently being given have no side effects. And so it's something that your quality of life remains very high, and yet we think it could be training your own body to kill these cancer cells.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that, and it certainly is an exciting time right now as new steps and progress is being made. As you know, this webinar was brought to you by Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. Thank you to Debbie Zellman, President and Founder, our speaker, Dr. Andrew Kennedy from Sarah Cannon Research Institute, and to Genentech for providing funding that helped make this webinar possible. As you see on your screen, we have upcoming events to get involved in and support. Details about these events are available on the Debbie's Dream website at www.debbiesdream.org. Thank you to all of our listeners today. Our next our next clinical trials webinar will be held on May 6th at 12:45 Eastern Time. We would love to hear your feedback, questions, and comments before then. Please send your thoughts to patient.resource@debbiesdream.org. Thank you again for joining us.